Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Dr. Muiris MacGiollabhuí's talk on Irish liberty, Black slavery, and the Green Atlantic. Dr. Muiris MacGiollabhuí is the Keough-Naughton Institute Moore Livingston Fellow for the 2021 academic year. He completed his PhD in history at the University of California in Santa Cruz in June 2019 and spent the last academic year teaching at Santa Clara University, primarily world history courses that focused on the history of imperialism in the early modern and modern periods, as well as American colonial history. Dr. MacGiollabhuí's work has appeared most recently in the Yearbook of Transnational History in the spring 2019 edition. His article, Carrying the Green Bow, the Transnational Exile of the United Irishmen, 1791 to 1806, explores the physical dimensions of exile that the United Irishmen experienced and the psychological impact that exile had on them as they were cast all around the world. His next article, which is based on his talk today, is currently under review for publication, explores the contractions of United Irish racial ideology. Dr. MacGiollabhuí was born in Dublin, but as a child of the Gaeltacht, the Irish-speaking area of Ireland. He has lived in North America for the last 11 years, both in Vancouver, British Columbia, and California. While his spoken Irish has diminished, and you can see that mine has as well, while away from Ireland, his love of Irish history remains. When not writing, he obsesses over his two sporting loves, Man United and the Edmonton Oilers. He loves cooking, cycling, and hiking, but rarely all at once. Prior to the pandemic, he could be found ruining the songs of others at karaoke and playing pool. I'm Shante Mouton-Kenyon, and I am currently the Moreau Postdoctoral Fellow in the English Department. Previously, I was the NEH Fellow at the Keough-Naughton Institute. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. MacGiollabhuí.
Thank you so much, Shante. What a lovely introduction. Thank you all for being here today. I want to give a special thanks to the Keough-Naughton Institute for Irish Studies, to whom I've been affiliated for the last 9 months. I've had an absolutely wonderful time meeting all of you, and it's just been a real pleasure to be here. So let me get this started. I'm going to start sharing my screen right now.
And just to remind everyone that you feel free to send in your questions as Muiris is talking, and we'll have a Q&A period after he finishes his talk.
Okay. Agus Lahana Gwelgori Galera Wanshaw, Diagweeb Galera. For all the Irish speakers here in attendance, thank you all for being here today. So I want to start off this talk by explaining what I'd like to do and what I'd love for all of you to be thinking through with me. And it all revolves around this kind of revolutionary period that's happening in the Atlantic world between about 1750, 1760, and about the early 19th century. And specifically, I want to be talking about the 1798 rebellion in Ireland. So the 1798 rebellion in Ireland and the revolutionary period in Ireland broadly, it's been explored, it's been thought through, it's been imagined, especially after 1998 with the bicentennial celebrations. But really, what I don't see, and I haven't seen in a comprehensive sense, is a detailed analysis of where race, and specifically for the case of this talk, slavery, lies in the United Irish political ideology. It has been explored in part. Nini Rogers, in particular, has done a fantastic job of explaining how the United Irishmen related to slavery in Ireland pre-1798. David Wilson, on his book on the United Irishmen in the United States, does a great job of explaining it really in the United States, mostly in northern cities. But what I'm really trying to do, both with this talk, a chapter of the book I'm writing is one that I've been revising this last current year, is really put them together, tried to get a unified sense of what race and specifically slavery mean for the United Irishmen, not just pre-1798, not just at the moment of 1798, but long duration, over this long 30, 40-year period. This, I hope, will address the gap, but I'm not the only person working on this type of work. And I want to take a moment to give kind of like a shout out to others who are doing this very important work. Other literature that is working through this question, the first that I'd like to name, and probably the most visible currently, is Neil Jordan's new novel that came out about 2 or 3 months or so ago, which explores the relationship between Lord Edward Fitzgerald and his servant and friend, Tony Small. Tony Small is an escaped slave who he meets in North America. Laura McKenna does similar work as Neil Jordan. Both are describing the experiences of living in Ireland in this kind of revolutionary period in the 1790s from the vantage point of Tony Small, this escaped slave. And also, this is Tony Small on the right-hand side of the slide here. So both McKenna and Neil Jordan have written these excellent books, so I'd encourage you all to look them up first and foremost. Academically, there's a research initiative that'll start in September by Professors Kieran O'Neill and Patrick Walsh at Trinity College Dublin to investigate what Trinity's role was in the slave trade. Studying the racial history of Ireland in the 18th century is not only important to place Irish history in the racialized history of this Atlantic world, but it's also seemingly of interest from a large number of Irish people. Ireland can, at times, seem a world away from the slave trade historically. But, for example, portions of Belfast's wealth, as I'm going to explain through this talk, were built on the backs of enslaved persons in the 18th century, if not directly. You rarely saw slaves or ever saw slaves in the port of Belfast, but you see the goods that are all slave produced coming into the docks. Slavery has touched the history of Ireland in a number of important ways. But over time, this has been minimized and forgotten. I think most recently are discussions around John Mitchell, who's on the left-hand side. This is his statue, who, as an Irish nationalist, also an American Confederate, and a champion of slaveholder rights, he is positioned in this very tenuous place within Irish history. He's perhaps the most visible and most spoken about in terms of this specific conversation. Immediately and visibly, for anybody that's walked around Dublin, this is College Green. They have both of these buildings face each other within the College Green area. This is in central Dublin. The entrance of Trinity College Dublin through the famous College Green front gate that's on the left-hand side here is one of Dublin's best known images. But few know or recognize that it was built with the money in the early 17th century from tobacco duties, tobacco being a prominent slave crop of the 17th century. And if you turn around on the streets of Dublin and look to College Green, you look at this magnificent facade of what was the original Irish Parliament, now is the Bank of Ireland branch. This was built with money from sugar duties, another crop raised by enslaved persons in the British-owned West Indies, specifically places like Jamaica. Even recently, articles in History Ireland stress how minimal Irish involvement actually was in the slave trade. But I don't necessarily agree with that. So, and this talk just being one small part of it, the process of revealing Ireland's legacy with slavery is an essential one. So I want to start this question off with something, or start this talk off with a question. Really, I want it to be bouncing around in your heads for the next 30 minutes or so. And let me ask you, so what did it mean to be Irish and to be revolutionary during the Age of Revolution? specifically when it came to race and slavery. So who were the United Irishmen? This is for anybody who would like a quick and dirty explanation about who these revolutionaries were. So the United Irishmen were established in 1791, and they had three major intentions. First, they objected to continued interference by the British government in Irish affairs. Second, they demanded parliamentary reform. Parliamentary reform had been a prominent political movement in Ireland since the 1780s. And finally, the United Irishmen called for greater union between Catholics and Protestants in Ireland and the dismantling of artificial boundaries that had been created by policies such as the penal laws, which had turned Catholics into second-class subjects. In short, the United Irishmen called for a multitude of divisions that had long kept Irish people away from each other, both emotionally and in a class sense. By 1798, seeing little other choice than outright rebellion, they had militarized in 1795, but had also been criminalized by the British Empire starting around 1794-95. They saw the last opportunity to achieve what they yearned for in 1798, where they had an unsuccessful rebellion against British rule. Their efforts were unsuccessful. Several of the leaders, including Theobald Wolfe Tone, who will come up a little bit in this talk, were sentenced to death. But the primary method of punishment for the United Irishmen, although many faced the hangman, the primary method of punishment for many of these United Irishmen was exile. Subsequently, thousands of United Irishmen were exiled around the world between 1798 and 1803. Some were forced out, some were encouraged to leave, lest they be shunned by their communities. Some got to choose where they went to. Others were forced onto ships and shipped wherever the British Empire needed them. Here is an image of where the United Irishmen are sent to after 1798. And just a quick note as well, these banishments and exiles, they're occurring by about 1794-95, but the most significant numbers of exile are occurring between 1798 and 1803. So the primary destination for the United Irishmen exiled in the Atlantic world were American ports like Philadelphia, New York City, Wilmington, Boston, Charleston, Newfoundland in British North America. They were also exiled to the Caribbean, often serving as soldiers in the British units, military units known as the condemned regiments, due to the high mortality rate from disease specifically. Here in places like the American South, like the Caribbean, northern cities, because slavery has not been abolished completely in these places yet. Here, the institution of slavery went from being an unseen and distant evil in Ireland to being a visible reality. One such United Irishman kind of exemplifies this story, this trajectory. His name is Dennis Driscoll. So Dennis Driscoll, and I don't have a picture of him because he's quite an elusive figure. Dennis, at least in an Irish sense, Dennis Driscoll was born in Cork as a Catholic, but sometime in his late 20s, he becomes Protestant. He eventually will become one of the executive board, effectively members of the United Irishmen, sitting on this executive board who make all of these decisions. He advocated for such things as universal male suffrage, property abolition, specifically property abolition for parliamentary participation. He was vehemently anti-slavery. He saw the conditions of Irish Catholics and the subjugation and enslavement of African slaves as comparable. This will be a theme that is going to be visible throughout this talk. Many of the ideas that he espoused were radical for the time, quite radical for the time. For his role in the newspaper, the Cork Gazette, he came to the attention of British officials who would imprison him for 2 years. We know little about his involvement in the 1798 rebellion, if anything. But what we do know is that in 1799, he left for New York City financially destitute. Dennis Driscoll, arriving in the United States in 1799, immediately became embroiled in the racial politics of the period. As one of the most outspoken advocates of slavery, anti-slavery politics as a member of the United Irishmen, Driscoll criticized the institution of slavery everywhere it existed, not just in the United States. He believed that, in his words, slavery is odious wherever it is practiced. Announcing his convictions loudly upon entry to the United States, Driscoll denounced the institution of slavery as this disgraceful stigma of the country. And in particular, Driscoll stressed for the American case that their practice, that is of slaveholding, is at war with their theory, that is of life, of liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. By 1803, just 4 years later, maybe 5, depending on what time of the year it was, Driscoll's position on slavery changes dramatically. He now conceded in a kind of unclear message. He writes, slavery is freedom, comparatively speaking. And I've been thinking about this line for a long, long time. What does he mean by that? Because he could take it in a lot of ways. But I think he means that the ability to access private property, which is being conceived of, as we're going to be talking about through the 18th century, as this holy grail of individual freedoms, is now something that's accessible to him and to many Irish people who are coming into the United States, things that they perhaps were not able to achieve in Ireland. So slavery is freedom, comparatively speaking. Moving to Georgia, the state that is, in 1804, Driscoll becomes this champion of slaveholder rights, while at the same time advocating for Ireland's ongoing struggle against the British Empire. He saw the plight of Ireland as one of enslavement of a colony by an unjust empire. Frequently, advertisements ran in his newspaper, the Augusta Chronicle, for runaway slaves. And placed right beside it were poems lamenting the enslavement of the Irish people, something that he maintained consistently through his lifetime. So while Dennis Driscoll's politics seem contradictory, they mirror many of the inconsistencies, as we'll see, with the United Irish racial ideology writ large. What we see in Driscoll is what we see in many United Irishmen. That is the evolution or the devolution of a political ideology that was quite limited in the first place. And this is really where I veer away from other historians. There was utility for the United Irishmen with respect to slavery, not only after 1798, but also before 1798 as well. Because the usage of the symbolism between the perceived enslavement of Irish Catholics and the actual enslavement of Black Africans was used to metaphorical effect during the 1790s, often to discredit British rule on a moral level. Before we talk a little bit about that, because I will be back to that, so what's influencing? What is the basis? What is the kernel and the influence of the construction of this racial ideology? What it requires, quite briefly, but importantly, is that we examine how the Enlightenment and how discussions around liberalism and individual freedoms shaped conversations for the United Irishmen about slavery. So the United Irishmen were profoundly impacted by the Enlightenment, and their inconsistencies on racial politics are rooted substantially there. At face value, for those of you who have it's been a while since you read David Hume and Montesquieu, how could these Enlightenment thinkers and revolutionaries be accepting of slavery, a concept that runs contrary to theories of fraternity and the rights of man? So with the exception of Jean Bodin, most prominent thinkers of the 16th and 17th centuries, to whom the United Irishmen often invoked, were able to find justifications for slavery by appealing to its utility and to its social order. Thomas Hobbes gave a blessing to bondage, acknowledging that slavery was the natural outcome of superior and inferior races. Just one example, by the 18th century, slavery, though, and how it was understood by Enlightenment thinkers, started to change a bit. And it was Montesquieu and David Hume, more than any other thinkers, who put Black slavery on the agenda for the European Enlightenment. Montesquieu hypothesized the world turned upside down, where slavery was applied to white Europeans. Hume, while rejecting slavery, wrote that, quote, "I am apt to suspect the Negroes and in general all other species of men to be naturally inferior to the whites." He makes explicit that he believes in a strict racial hierarchy. Francis Hutcheson wrote in A System of Moral Philosophy that slavery violated all sense of natural justice. Voltaire, while a vocal opponent of slavery, believed that Black slaves lacked the inherent humanity of white Europeans and were subsequently inferior. Mary Wollstonecraft will remain a constant opponent of slavery during the period, one of the few who's consistent on the issue. But as David Bryan Davis, a prominent historian of slavery around the Atlantic world, specifically in the United States, writes, there were many planters in Virginia, Jamaica, San Domingue, who were open to the spirit of the Enlightenment. They did not, however, decide to give up their slaves after reading Montesquieu. Perhaps the thinker to whom the United Irishmen collectively resemble is probably John Locke. At face value, Locke does accept the institution of slavery in practice. This is reflected by his stocks in slave trading companies and his role in drafting the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, which codified slavery in the Carolinian colonies. But he also seems at times to reject the institution of slavery. In this vein, the United Irishmen resemble Locke on slavery. They generally rejected the institution of slavery in theory, but often prospered from its existence. Another theme that I think really informs the United Irish racial ideology is the idea of liberalism. So liberalism is the late 18th century idea, a political doctrine that attributed rights to individuals that no government, no matter how democratic or just, could violate. It offered one of the most important legal and ideological protections for slavery in the 19th and late 18th century. And I draw on a historian called Andrew Zimmerman for a lot of this theorization. Liberalism is defined as private, defines rights rather as private, and the ultimate such right was the right to hold private property. Racism, of course, was central to the definition of some humans being defined as property. But liberalism also meant that no matter what a legislator or judge thought of people of African descent, or the morality of holding enslaved persons rather, the state could not interfere with private property rights. In one such case, for the American example, Dred Scott in 1857, this was a Supreme Court decision, not only denied citizenship and rights to people of African descent, but it also affirmed that slavery enjoyed the same constitutional protections of every other form of property holding. Despite a genuine moral revulsion of many liberals towards slavery, the individual right to private property stymied efforts to actually overthrow it. We might say the same of liberal responses today to a whole slew of things like mass poverty and global climate change. Liberal humanism provided the central ideological perspective of white middle-class abolitionists and reveals the extent of their complicity in, not precisely racial slavery, because they did abstain from that, but rather the construction of a hierarchy of people and property of which racial slavery was a component. It was not working class opponents of slavery, but middle class abolitionists who separated in many ways race and class, slavery and capitalism. But in fact, what we know now is that these are co-producing. But better to detach the latter from critiques of the former. The concept of racial capitalism then, by contrast, reminds us that there is no viable analysis of racism or of capitalism that treats either in isolation. They are intrinsically linked. The very founding of the United Irishmen as this middle-class reformist organization informs then their difficulty ideologically in addressing how slavery, even if denounced by them, informed their class position in Irish society and would inform their class position in places like the United States later down the line. And in fact, as I'm going to show you right now, they could draw on slavery, this is the United Irishmen, they could draw on slavery and integrate it into their own politics and utilize it beneficially. So the United Irishmen highlighted the persecution of Irish Catholics and stressed that African slaves and the suffering of the Irish Catholic under British yoke were comparable. This was done both to stress the inhumanity of slavery broadly, but also to legitimize the grievances of Irish nationalists by signaling that Catholic subjugation was akin to black slavery. It was meant to highlight the multiplicities of British tyranny, not just British tyranny when it came to the Irish example. The United Irishmen used the arrival of the most famous ex-slave of the period of the 1790s, that is Olaudah Equiano. Olaudah Equiano arrives in Belfast to publicize his book, The Interesting Narrative, in 1791. And the United Irishmen, while delighted to have Olaudah Equiano in Belfast, they use this as a moment to produce an internal town hall with a vote, and the vote being on what Catholic emancipation would look like. Would it be immediate? Would it be over a sustained period of time? Or would it not happen at all? And it was put to a vote with several hundred people in the building. It is important that this town hall vote happened while Equiano was visiting. The United Irishmen were able to speak through black slavery through the eyes of Olaudah Equiano and also give credence to the subjugation of Irish Catholics. This sort of utilization of black slavery happens a lot during the 1790s. The Northern Star, which was the newspaper and central mouthpiece of the United Irishmen in Belfast, regularly made comparisons between Irish Catholics and black enslaved persons. The Northern Star noted that, quote, equal rights and equal laws would end slavery, black and Irish Catholic. Theobald Wolfe Tone, one of the prominent and most remembered leaders of the United Irishmen, used the rhetoric of slavery advantageously. In a 16-page pamphlet, Tone used terms like slavery, slave, bondage to describe the Irish Catholic under British rule as oppressed peoples. Tone and others would stress that the oppression of the Irish was part of a system of British oppression broadly, not just one solely in Ireland. While black slavery was used advantageously by the United Irishmen, there were, of course, those who in this fraternal organization sincerely rejected the institution, both in Ireland and in exile later, which we're going to see. For United Irishmen like Samuel Nielsen, black slavery was morally unacceptable, it was unjust, and it was an abomination. He will maintain this position in perpetuity. Nielsen, one of the founding members of the United Irishmen, who was dubbed the Jacobin in reference to French radicals, he was called this by Theobald Wolfe Tone. He could be deeply invested in the abolition of slavery, but also as an editor of the Northern Star, the newspaper I commented on, he could also, happening at the same time, use the idea of black slavery advantageously for the promotion of Irish interests. Mary Ann McCracken, who remained a staunch abolitionist through the entirety of her life, would, unbeknownst to her, gain from black slavery. It's said that Mary Ann McCracken would stand in the docks of Belfast all the way through her 80s, calling for the abolition of slavery. When a family friend, James Nielsen, who I'll introduce you to at the end of the talk, dies, he leaves behind him 5 enslaved persons in his will. A portion of the money gained from the sale of these enslaved persons actually will go to Mary Ann McCracken, unbeknownst to her. So it's very complicated, very intertwined. There was a strong anti-slavery sentiment in Belfast even before the United Irishmen. I just want to stress that as well. It doesn't just start with the United Irishmen. When a petition was written by a merchant called Waddell Cunningham in 1786, one of the wealthiest merchants of Belfast, to introduce a slave trading company into Belfast, it was met with firm resistance by Belfast merchants, and many of these would eventually establish the United Irishmen. In a scathing rebuke, Thomas McCabe, on the petition made by Cunningham to allow the institution of slavery into Belfast, wrote, "May God wither the hand and assign the name to eternal infamy of the man who will sign that document." McCabe revelled in his self-appointed name, that is, the Irish slave. William Drennan, one of the leading United Irishmen in Belfast, attempted a boycott of sugar and rum from the West Indies so as to scupper the slave trade. This signalled continuity with McCabe's actions. But while there was, I would say, broadly popular support among the United Irishmen that slavery was an ill of society, some United Irishmen, even before 1798, before exile, held little or no interest in the abolition of the slave trade. And this is really important. William Sinclair, one of the founding members of the United Irishmen, acknowledged the importance of emancipating Catholics, but not the emancipation of slaves. Many leaders of the United Irishmen wanted the shackles of economic opportunity loosened for middle-class Presbyterians, but not the physical shackles of those enslaved around the Atlantic world. Because involved in the textile trade, especially with the United States and the Caribbean, Sinclair saw the role of enslaved persons in picking cotton, growing tobacco, as essential to industrial growth in Ireland. And while the links between Belfast and slavery are less obvious than the links between Bristol, Manchester with the slave trade, the wealth of the town relied on trade with the Caribbean, especially with rope making, meat packing, salting, flour milling, all of these different things, all coming and being produced or being sent to the West Indies. In this context, it makes sense in terms of Sinclair's self-interest that he was intent on the gradual abolition of the penal laws, but actively against the abolition of slavery. Because the rejection of slavery was subsumed by economic advantage. And this was the case for several of the nascent United Irishmen pre-1798. While in Ireland, the popular consensus was disapproval of the slave trade, but there was never complete disapproval of the institution. In exile, popular belief that slavery should be abolished became even less clear and less defined. In fact, as we'll see, United Irishmen became active participants in the reproduction of the slave trade as slaveholders, as slave merchants. So the question I ask you is, what happened in exile? One of my favorite United Irishmen, I'll start with a quote from him. His name is Archibald Hamilton Rowan. So as a United Irishman, he's exiled early pre-1798 from Ireland. And he's living in the United States, and he's planning a trip into the interior of the US states, into what is now Western Pennsylvania. So he writes to his wife, Sarah, who's in Philadelphia in 1796 at this point, he writes, I will not go into the woods. Sorry, I will go into the woods. That would be a terrible start to any letter. I will go into the woods, but I will not kill Indians, nor keep slaves. While these sentiments were noble for every United Irishman who rejected slavery, there were many more who partook, whether grudgingly, acquiescently, or acceptingly, or enthusiastically, of the institution while in exile. And for the purposes of the rest of this talk, for the next 15 or 20 minutes, I might not be that long actually, now looking at the time, I'll stick to the United States. And I want to start with kind of the two kind of classic rationales for why this is the case in terms of slaveholding and how they're used a little later on in the 1830s, 40s, 50s. The first is that there was labor competition between free Black Americans and Irish immigrants. So the maintenance of slavery was worthwhile. The second is that the United Irishmen, who become aligned with the Democratic Republicans, there are two parties in the United States at the turn of the 19th century, Democratic Republicans under Thomas Jefferson and the Federalists under John Adams. The Democratic Republicans are much more invested in slavery. Thomas Jefferson being a great example of this. He would reject the morality of slavery, but is a slaveholder, as numerous historical accounts show us. So being aligned with the Democratic Republicans meant that they became more accepting of slavery so as to facilitate political mobility in the US. But the reality of both of these things, both the labor competition and the relationship with the Democratic Republicans, it gives us only like a small entryway into the story. The reality is that the reading of these two conditions actually superimposes the conditions of the mid-19th century onto the early 19th century. While there was fierce labor competition in US cities, this seems very far removed from the intense fighting that would occur over jobs starting in the 1820s and really ramping up in the 1830s and the 1840s. While derided and initially barred from entering the United States by the Federalist Party, specifically by men like Rufus King and William Cobbett, the United Irishmen will become very quickly entrenched within the Democratic Republican Party. But there were many who would affiliate with the Democratic Republican Party, but who would remain in opposition to slavery. It's much more likely that occurrences and events like the introduction of the Jay Treaty in 1794 would have a more prolific and important impact as to why the United Irishmen are aligned with the Democratic Party rather than things like slavery. The Jay Treaty is this trade agreement that shores up relations between the US and Britain. A lot of United Irishmen were firmly against it. They saw it as an indication that the US was kind of like, in this moment under Federalist rule, selling out and reincorporating Britain into their kind of sphere of cooperation. So I see certain value by the 1830s and 1820s in the question of labor competition and the relationship between the United Irishmen and the Democratic Republicans, but it doesn't give us the full story. Actually, it's actually harkening back to the political ideology and what informs it, which I think, and liberalism, which I think is much more important in producing a clear answer, although a clear answer is hard to ascertain because it's on such an individual level often. What about whiteness? Whiteness is such a prominent concept, in particular by the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. This is spoken about beautifully by David Rhetoric and Noel Ignatieff, to name just two. And they'll speak about how the Irish, in Noel Ignatieff's words, became white by the middle of the 19th century. It's a thesis that I don't necessarily agree with, and I could talk about it at a later point. But what I want to stress is that this becoming white narrative, it's even less clear for the United Irishmen at the beginning of the 19th century, because they had the vestiges of whiteness and didn't need to assimilate into whiteness in America, in the United States at the beginning of the 19th century. They were regarded as white upon entry. They had access to jobs, they had access to the vote almost immediately, although it'll be slowed up in 1798. Naturalization will move to 2 years. They didn't need to make explicit in the same way the Irish Catholics arriving, in particular, arriving in the 1840s and 1850s, how they had the capacity to become white. Also, the absence, not completely, but relative again to this period, of nativism, know-nothingism of the 1840s and 1850s also informs this. They were considered radicals upon entry into the United States. Again, the Federalists wanted to keep them out, but they were considered radicals, and that's about it. But there were many people considered radicals in the United States, Democratic Republicans in particular being a great example of that, considered by the Federalists. What I believe is that the political foundations of the United Irishmen and their thinking allowed for slavery to be integrated into their political ideology in the US in a much bigger sense that it had been integrated into their political ideology in Ireland. So we're going to talk about a few of the figures, the kind of biographies of some of the people that are involved, both against, acquiescent, and slave holding in this moment. So while we cannot assess how many United Irishmen accepted or rejected slavery, it is possible to assume that only a small percentage became active agents in its abolition or active participants in the emancipation of slaves while in exile. Two of them are Thomas Addis Emmett on the left and William Sampson just above. So Emmett was born in Cork City. He took the United Irish Oath in 1795. And in the aftermath of the 1798 rebellion, he's jailed in Kilmainham and then Fort George in Scotland. And in 1804, he'll move to the United States. He'll expressly not move to Virginia. A friend of his implores him to come, but he expressly says, no way, I'm not going there. No chance in hell because of slavery. On slavery, Emmett retained a fundamental rejection of slavery that he expressed with his work with the New York State Manumission Society. His first case, in fact, was representing a fugitive slave. And one of the most important cases fought by Emmett was the 1805 manumission case against a ship captain. And it's remembered as one of the most stunning victories in the New York State Manumission Society's 66-year existence, in part because of the huge fine that was placed upon the ship captain for the illegal importation of enslaved people. Emmett was aligned with the Democratic Republican Party, even though he vocally opposed the institution of slavery. His career is not spotless, however. Later in Emmett's career in 1820, he will defend a ship captain who is accused of slave trading, which I can talk about at a later point as well. William Sampson, just above in my slide, he played an equally important role in the manumission of slaves in the United States. In 1798, he was arrested and forced to leave Ireland. His ship was wrecked off the coast of Wales, and he then traveled to Portugal. He left for New York City in 1806. Strangely, he does not comment or express his feelings about how he felt about the institution of slavery in his own memoirs, but he does in the court records to which he is involved. Sampson's first major case was in 1809 when he defended a black mother and her child who were brutally beaten by their slave owner, Amos Broad, and his wife. Sampson was successfully able to get both Betty, the mother, and the child, Sarah, manumitted. Sampson saw the humanity of Betty and also the brutality of slavery. In fact, his defense of an interracial marriage between a black woman and a white man indicates further his position. On the issue, he noted that every man must follow his own pleasure. Neither philosophy nor religion have forbade such mixtures. And through this period, Sampson also, like Emmett, will subscribe to the Democratic Republican Party, perhaps through necessity than expectation. But as time wears on, he will start to fade out of the political sphere of the Democratic Republicans, maybe because of slavery, but it's not clear. If Thomas Addis Emmett and William Sampson represent the occasion for the rejection of slavery in the United States, then it's men like Matthew Carey who personifies its acceptance by the United Irish community. In particular, the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade changed the tenor of the conversation for exiled United Irishmen. The British Empire was no longer as complicit as it once was in the slave trade, and the United States now became the dominant slaveholding nation of the world. This is a theme that I'm kind of playing around with. How did the British Empire, becoming this kind of abolition empire, or one that is sympathetic to abolition, how did it change the relationship between the United Irishmen and slavery? That's something I'm still thinking through. So Matthew Carey was born in Ireland in 1760 and fled to the United States when threatened with reprisals for criticising the British government. While he was not present in Ireland during the 1790s, he maintained a strong commitment to the United Irish cause. Therefore, I consider him a United Irishman. First aligned with the Federalist Party, Carey joined Jefferson's Democratic Republicans in response, as I was noting, to the Jay Treaty. By the 1820s, Matthew Carey, along with prominent American politician Henry Clay, became the nation's most significant advocates of the American system. That is the end of the over-reliance of the Atlantic trade system and a move to unify the American states, the North, the South, and also the West, and incorporate it into this trade network, into a much more effective trade network, in the words of Carey, and the construction of this empire of liberty, Jefferson's kind of baby in many ways. Carey favored a transition to economic nationalism, but maintained that slavery in states like Virginia had to remain. He pushed for greater industrialization, a move away from plantations in the South, and the introduction instead of large factories. Slavery in this domestic economy was an unavoidable obstacle, according to Carey. He did not believe, moreover, that the small minority of Americans who were pushing for abolition should determine the future of the country. Both Clay and Carey proclaimed that in order to align the economy with Jeffersonian ideals, it required the expansion of the nation state and in its economic role and the consolidation of agricultural and manufacturing industries, which were split along a north-south line. On the Missouri Compromise in 1820, in terms of the integration of Missouri into the United States, Carey contended that, quote, the peace and prosperity of 8 million free men and Christians may not rightfully be sacrificed to promote the welfare of 1.5 million slaves. So as to produce this unified national economy in Carey's imagination, Americans needed to deny Black freedom. William Duane plays a similar role as Carey. Duane came from, and he is just above here. Actually, Duane's on the left, sorry. Duane came from a family of Irish patriots. Born near Lake Champlain in New York, he was taken by his mother to Ireland when he was 5. He was disinherited from marrying a Protestant. He became a printer and went to Calcutta in India. He prospered until he was deported for printing attacks against government officials of the East India Company. And he'll eventually arrive in the United States in 1796. Right when you have this bitter partisan division between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Duane believed that slavery, and also he deeply aligned with the United Irish cause. Duane believed that slavery, in his words, slavery is congenial to the habits of thinking and to the conditions of actual Africans and their immediate descendants. And kind of explaining this further and how he felt about Black enslaved persons. In a letter to Thomas Jefferson, Duane gave rationale that Black slaves should be allowed to serve in the army, quote, to employ them as soldiers would be to save as many of the whites. And then finally, with colonization efforts, to whom the United Irishmen aligned with benevolent and immigration societies in major cities of the North become involved in the colonization efforts, that is, moving en masse slaves back to Africa, kind of moving the issue under the rug. And this was very popular among Irish immigrants, especially by the 1830s and the 1840s. And then I'm going to finish talking about the United Irishmen who were engaged immediately in slaveholding and slave trading. For some United Irishmen, slavery was no issue to condemn or to avoid, but rather it was an institution that they could become actively and financially involved in. John Nielsen is a great example of this. John Nielsen is born roughly in 1775 in the north of Ireland and was apprenticed in Belfast. Both he and his brothers, William and Samuel, they were accused of participation in the 1798 rebellion after weapons were found in their mother's house in Antrim. William was hanged and both John and Samuel were exiled. Samuel died en route to the West Indies, and John, knowing his fate would be similar, escaped to the United States, aware that what banishment meant to the Caribbean. He will work as a master joiner, specifically for Thomas Jefferson, through most of his life in Monticello and in a place called Montpellier. I don't know if I'm not sure how they pronounce it in the US. He dies June 24th, 1827. And in his will, which was to be divided between his family in the United States and his family back home and some family friends, he had a number of slaves that were auctioned off and the proceeds sent. And as I stated a little earlier on, Mary Ann McCracken was one of those who benefited from the sale of these enslaved persons. Nielsen's family, even thousands of miles away, were still benefactors of the slave trade. While the majority of prominent United Irishmen exiled to the United States arrived in northern ports, a large number actually went to southern American ports as well. And this is something that's still being teased out in terms of the archival work, finding these United Irishmen who ended up in American southern states. Just one example, Salem Gazette in Boston writes in 1800, speaking on Norfolk, Virginia, how 400 United Irishmen were vomited forth, in their words, onto the shore of Virginia. And of those who decided to stay in the South, many would become slaveholders. One such example is James Bones, who, as an Antrim rebel turned Georgia linen merchant, by 1820, he'll own 15 enslaved persons. In a similar vein, Anthony Campbell, a United Irishman in Notchie, Mississippi, he posted several runaway slave ads in 1819. Maybe perhaps the most interesting of these southern slaveholders was Harmon Blennerhassett. So Blennerhassett he was from Dublin, joined the United Irishmen in 1793 when they were much less radical compared to how they would be in 1798. And when they were dedicated more to reform politics. In 1794, he married his niece, yes, you read that correctly, Margaret Agnew. In 1796, worried by the radical route that the United Irishmen were taking, but I think really because he married his niece and wanted to leave Ireland because of the abuse he was getting for it, he eventually moves to the United States. Due to his large fortune he had inherited in Ireland, he became an attractive funder for Aaron Burr and Aaron Burr's incursion into Mexico in 1806. Burr, after this, will effectively lose the majority of his fortune. This is his mansion in the Ohio River Valley, now in West Virginia. It had been burned down after Burr's incursion into Texas, but has been reproduced here, and it's now a tourist site. Blennerhassett would never return to the site of the mansion pictured here, although, as I said, it'll be rebuilt. From here, the Blennerhassetts moved to Fort Gibson in Mississippi, and with what little they had left, they purchased a cotton plantations, and on it they had a series of enslaved persons. Both in Mississippi and in what will become Western Virginia, the Blennerhassetts used slavery consistently for labor purposes. They really saw the utility in it. They'll eventually move back to Europe in the 1820s, completely financially destitute, and they'll die in poverty there. I want to conclude this talk. I just want to. I want we all of us to be thinking through all of these different stories, all of these different biographies, all of these different idiosyncrasies. What do we make of these stories? What do we make of this story writ large? This talk is really a call to explore what it meant to be radical when it came to slavery at a particular moment in history. And what it does is, I hope, it reveals how the revolutionary period was rife with these kind of inconsistencies. The United Irish case is not unique. It's actually part of a larger system of inconsistencies, because the revolutionary period is a period of Janissenian politics that is seemingly contradictory things that actually exist in relation to one another. The contradictions between slavery and liberty, contradictions between democracy and absolutism. All of these things, they seem at first to be mutually exclusive, but in fact they can be co-producing. For many immigrants, for example, in the United States, maybe slavery for them, in Dennis Driscoll's words, to go back to him, was freedom, comparatively speaking, because they now had the opportunity to achieve wealth that was never possible for them in Ireland. Moving forward, and not just with the United Irishmen, but with Irish history broadly, I feel like we should be open to examine and talk through some of these contradictions of this island, and to think through where they all belong in and how they belong and how we belong in the history of this world. We should be thinking about ourselves not just as ex-colonized people, but also as people that have been actively engaged in reproducing inequalities. Moreover, we should celebrate those figures who stayed true and consistent to their beliefs, people like Samuel Nielsen and Marianne McCracken, but also to think through why some were so willing to forego their ideals. The Irish are fantastic at memorializing and celebrating the good parts of the diaspora. But what about the bad parts of the diaspora? Where does that fit? So this is an opportunity to look at where Ireland sits on the global stage as people and as individuals, and how we can imagine ourselves to play a more constructive and equitable role moving forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Muiris. We are running short on time, but there are a few questions. We'll go 10 minutes after the hour just to take a few questions. I have one question. That was a very interesting talk, very generative. I'm thinking of Henry Joy McCracken, actually, and like where he fits into this narrative. But then you also brought up Intiev's point about the Irish becoming white. And while he made that phrase popular, it was actually James Baldwin that says it first, and Intiev actually mentions it later in life, but it's not quoted in his book. That he came across this phrase in an article that Baldwin wrote in 1985, where Baldwin talks about, the Irish Middle Passage was just as brutal as mine, but upon entry, kind of like what you said, they became white, and they began rising from there. And so I'm thinking of a lot of things here. I mean, you also brought up John Mitchell, who I find it particularly offensive when I visit an Irish memorial site. There's one in Boston that has a John Mitchell quote on it, and in talking about this idea of slavery and the Irish famine, and then there's this quote from Mitchell. And so it's really offensive. But you use this idea of Driscoll's, and you mentioned this idea of Driscoll's, slavery was freedom, comparatively speaking. And so it's making me think of, well, I guess for someone who had been marginalized, someone who had saw themselves as slaves, the Irish have historically used the rhetoric, as you said, of slavery. And then coming into the United States, slavery was freedom for them. They are freed from the shackles of slavery by being able to come to this country and ascend into the ruling class. So I was just wondering if you could expand on that a little bit more.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I think the Baldwin kind of acknowledgement is a brilliant one, right? Yeah, like so. Yeah. I've been thinking about this Dennis Driscoll kind of quote for a long, long time, and I think, yeah, I don't think it wasn't like a cultural assimilation which many Irish immigrants really yearned for in by the 1840s, 1850s, because of the class position, because of the perceived racial position of Irish Catholics. For many of those who were coming over as Irish Protestants, all of these avenues were already open for them, right? So it was, but what it was an economic assimilation, right? I'm not even sure if economic assimilation, but it's an economic entryway into participation in an Atlantic world, not necessarily just an entryway into the Atlantic world, something that many of them felt like they had been deprived of while living in Ireland. So I think it absolutely, yeah, I think it makes sense. So yeah, no, as I was saying, the Nollaig, and even then the Nollaig Nassiev, kind of how the Irish became white, 1840s and 1850s. That's still something that I categorically, it's a useful framework, I would say, but I've never completely found it compelling, because the Irish had the right to vote when they arrived in the United States. The Irish had the right for class mobility quite soon after their arrival in Ireland. For the United Irishmen, it was even quicker. It was even instantaneously. They became part of, Matthew Carey, William Duane. They become some of the drivers of media, and even the ones that are coming immediately in 1798, like William Sampson. They become some of the drivers of the Democratic Republican immediately. Thomas Jefferson kind of welcomes them into the fold, whereas for the 1840s, 1850s Irish, it is a slower process, but still a process that they have that is open to them quite soon after entry.
Colin Barr asks, he says, you use terms such as they and their to refer to the United Irishmen in the period after 1798 and down as far as the 1830s, if I understood you correctly. To what extent do the United Irishmen continue to exist as an organization or coherent ideology, or indeed as a useful category of historical analysis? And at what point do the people you are describing become individuals who take up a variety of disparate positions for a variety of personal reasons, informed by the varied places and contexts in which they found themselves?
It's a hell of a question. I love it. No, it's great. Well, here's the other thing. Were the United Irishmen ever united in Ireland? It's the first place to start. No. No. Right. They had a whole series of different contradictory positions on things like Catholic emancipation, in terms of how much they wanted to separate from Britain, if they wanted to separate at all. Deep skepticism of Catholics at times, that they would murder them in their sleep, which is, in part what would inform many Presbyterians involved in the 1798 rebellion, eventually actually becoming part of Orange orders. So the disunited United Irishmen, how much do they still exist as this unified kind of people in the United States? The they is only a placeholder, I feel like. The they describes these networks of communication, because they don't only become individuals in the United States. They become part of these networks. They're all talking to each other. Like sons and daughters of ex-United Irishmen are marrying each other. They're still writing letters to each other around the country. They're all informing their own political views independently, but they're also informing their political views in conversation with one another. And they're all, whether they're cognizant of it or thinking about it or not, they're all part of an exiled community. They really believe that. They believe that they're part of this exiled community, and they never really forget that. So while, yes, they have all of these individual belief systems that are at times working against each other, they do belong to forces that they can't control, which is their relationship to exile in the Atlantic world, and the psychological and kind of mental effects that has on their transition, on their expulsion out of Ireland. But I think it's a great question, Colin. So to sum up, it's useful as a placeholder, but of course it is fraught, because how can we talk about all of these different people under one particular term? So yeah.
Ian Newman said, he really enjoyed this presentation, and he wanted to ask you, we'll have to send him the response because he had to step off, but I wonder though, whether you see a rhetoric of sentiment or sensibility in the writings of United Irishmen, either in Belfast or in Exile. It is notable that the abolition movement depended heavily on a language of feeling, partly because of the limitations of Enlightenment rationality and its implications for property, which could be and was used to defend slavery. And I think that rhetoric, you brought up the Northern Star, and there were lots of poems in there that alluded to the Negroes. I think one was actually called the Negroes Complaint or the Negroes Condition. Yep. And so there was really this rhetoric, and I think it goes back also to what you were saying about the rhetoric of slavery.
So just remind me, so what exactly was he talking about in terms of the language of sensibility, just so I have a good grasp?
He asks particularly, is this connected to this role of Enlightenment, the implications of property, which could be and was used to defend slavery?
Oh, how do I answer that? I mean, yeah, I think I have to think about that one, this language of sensibility. I don't want to give unthought through answer about that. I'm not sure, but I'm going to reach out to him and I'm going to think about it. Detailed answer.
And then finally, we can take a question from Matthew Forado. He says, thanks for this very interesting presentation. How do you include the question of republicanism, defined as a link between personal independence, liberty, i.e. citizenship based on individual rights, and collective independence, liberty, sovereign nation, in your analysis of the United Irishmen take on slavery? Would you say that republicanism based on anti-slavery united the United Irishmen, which we've already said didn't really happen, in all of their components, and then their experience in the US as a slave-based republic divided them, contributing to competing conditions of republicanism in return?
Oh, absolutely. Here's the thing, this is the rule of the majority at times, right? This is the rule of not just the majority, but those who will garner control, garner power. And what the big secret is that while the democracies are hugely beneficial for a majority of people, they often leave, and we see this to this day around democracies around the world, right? They often leave those that are minority populations, Black and brown people on the sidelines. So yes, of course, there is a direct kind of tension at play here. Specifically, it will play out in Ireland. It still plays out in Ireland today in terms of who's left on the sidelines, and it certainly played out in the Republican United States. I mean, the line from Matthew Carey on the Missouri Compromise is a brilliant example of this. Why should we worry about the well-being of 1.5 million slaves if it impacts the health and happiness and the pursuit of happiness, that is the pursuit of property, of 8 million people moving west?
I mean, one of John Mitchell's arguments was that the slaves were housed and fed and taken care of where his brethren were dying of hunger and had no place to live.
Right. So, right.
Seen as a state.
This is the classic kind of and this kind of feeds into the Irish slave narrative that is produced. And this is actually something that Irish people can really push back against in Ireland, that actually is productive, is kind of trying to avoid these conversations of the Irish slavery narrative in the United States, in tenements, and the Irish slaves that are sent to places like Barbados in the Caribbean, right? And really pushing against this, the comparative nature, the comparative experiences of these two vastly different experiences.
Well, thank you, Muiris. That was really exciting. We really appreciate it. I'm Shante Mouton-Kenyon of Notre Dame. I'm a Rowe postdoc, and it was a pleasure to have you today.
Thank you all. I'm sorry for going a little over.
We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.